The surrender of Japan in 1945 did not bring peace. It merely brought a pause. The global battle for territory and ideology immediately shifted from the smoking ruins of Berlin to the cold, silent shadows of Washington and Moscow. World War II had proven one thing beyond any doubt: intelligence was power. Without reliable information about enemy intentions, victory was impossible. The U.S. had relied on temporary agencies like the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, during the war. But as the rivalry with the Soviet Union hardened, a rivalry based not on clear lines of battle, but on nuclear secrets and ideological subversion, it became clear that a temporary fix would not suffice. The United States needed a permanent, centralized, global apparatus devoted to espionage. The greatest military conflict in history gave birth to the greatest, most enduring intelligence war ever fought. The U.S. decision to build a permanent security state was codified on July 26, 1947. With the signing of the National Security Act, this single piece of legislation fundamentally reorganized the U.S. government, combining the Army and Navy into the Department of Defense, creating the Air Force, and most importantly, establishing the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The CIA was created primarily to fill a clear, vital need: centralized intelligence. The American government was tired of various departments holding information hostage. The CIA was tasked with coordinating intelligence activities and presenting fused analysis to the President and the National Security Council. Crucially, the Act gave the CIA a mandate for other functions and duties as the National Security Council may from time to time direct. This vague, open-ended clause became the justification for the CIA's aggressive role in covert action, a sphere of operations that would soon define the entire Cold War and lead to decades of international controversy. The agency was designed for perpetual global war by proxy, a war waged not with tanks and infantry, but with lies, money, and manipulation. Facing the newly formed CIA was the Soviet Union's equally potent and far more ruthless counterpart, the KGB, Committee for State Security. While the CIA was a relatively new creation built on American bureaucracy and democratic principles, the KGB was the latest iteration of a security apparatus with decades of experience in internal repression and international espionage. Stretching back to Lenin's Cheka, the KGB was not just an intelligence agency. It was an instrument of the Soviet Party. It controlled vast internal security forces, border guards, and most critically for the early Cold War, managed the entire Soviet nuclear program. The rivalry between these two giants was immediate and existential. The early espionage war centered on three core areas: nuclear secrets, stealing the scientific data and designs needed for the atomic and hydrogen bombs; political intentions, discovering what the opposing leader, president or party chief planned to do next; covert influence, using propaganda, funding, and disinformation to manipulate political outcomes in non-aligned nations. In the chaos and secrecy of the immediate post-war era, the most valuable assets were the scientists, diplomats, and agents willing to switch allegiance. This was the era of the Great Defections. The most damaging early loss for the West involved the Cambridge Five, a ring of high-ranking British intelligence officers, most notably Kim Philby, who had been recruited by the Soviets while studying at Cambridge in the 1930s. By the 1950s, these men were holding sensitive positions within NATO and the British Secret Service, MI6. These double agents provided Moscow with unprecedented access to Western military and diplomatic planning. They betrayed U.S. and British operations and compromised hundreds of agents, proving that the enemy was not just across the border, but often sitting at the same table. The constant threat of infiltration led to a wave of paranoia within both the CIA and the U.S. domestic intelligence sphere. The search for the mole became a permanent, psychologically crippling element of the post-war security state. The war was fought just as intensely in the public mind. Both agencies used massive resources to wage a global propaganda war. The U.S. established organizations like the Voice of America and secretly funded cultural and academic organizations to promote Western ideology. The Soviets used similar tactics, flooding the globe with pro-Soviet narratives and anti-American disinformation. The intelligence war became a vast, global marketplace of ideas where the objective was to convince the billions of non-aligned people in Africa, Asia, and South America that one-system democracy or communism was the inevitable future. The CIA's creation marked the end of an era where foreign policy was conducted solely by diplomats and soldiers. It ushered in the age of the hidden hand, where wars could be started, governments could be toppled, and national destinies could be altered with a single briefcase of cash or a well-placed disinformation campaign. The seeds of the enduring shadow state had been sown. Asterisk if Washington, D.C. and Moscow were the brains of the Cold War, Berlin was its exposed nerve center. The former capital of Hitler's Reich was carved into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet, with the Western zones existing as an island of capitalism and freedom deep inside the communist East German state. This unique geopolitical deformity made Berlin the undisputed spy capital of the world. Agents from the CIA, MI6, and the West German BND rubbed shoulders with agents from the KGB, the East German Stasi, and intelligence services from every satellite nation. It was a city of double agents, clandestine meetings in smoky bars, and the constant, chilling presence of the adversary. The most critical and vulnerable assets were the physical lines of communication. In the immediate post-war scramble, Soviet communication lines remained, largely dependent on cables laid during the Nazi-era cables that ran directly beneath the streets of Berlin. These cables carried the most sensitive information: KGB operational plans, Soviet military movements, and high-level diplomatic communication between Moscow and the Soviet command in East Germany. If the West could tap those cables, they could look directly into the mind of the enemy. The challenge was immense. The Soviet sector was sealed off, patrolled, and under constant surveillance. Going above ground was impossible. The solution proposed by the CIA and executed in a joint operation with the British MI6 was audacious, almost unbelievable. They would go beneath the earth. The plan, codenamed Operation Gold or Operation Stopwatch by the British, called for digging a massive secret tunnel from the U.S. sector under the border and directly into the heart of the Soviet communications network. The American side of the operation was driven by William King Harvey, a tough, seasoned CIA operative who treated the project like a military campaign. In 1954, construction began near the border of the American and Soviet zones. The secrecy was absolute. The engineering feat alone was staggering. The CIA needed a massive, reinforced steel and concrete tunnel that would withstand the immense weight of the city above it, avoid groundwater, and remain completely undetectable. The digging was done in shifts with workers sworn to secrecy. The noise of the excavation was masked by the construction of a large, seemingly innocuous warehouse built over the entrance in the U.S. sector, complete with loud heating units and active demolition work to cover the sound of the shovels and machinery. Tunnel eventually extended 1,476 feet, 450 meters underground, passing directly beneath Soviet lines. It was a physical testament to the CIA's newfound logistical capabilities. Once the engineers reached the target zone, they managed to cleanly tap 3 vital cables, one carrying Soviet military traffic, one carrying KGB traffic, and one carrying East German Soviet diplomatic communications. The intelligence success was immediate and profound. For nearly a year, beginning in 1955, Operation Gold pumped a massive stream of invaluable, raw data back to Washington and London, providing an unparalleled look into the Soviet bloc's operations. The CIA viewed the operation as a spectacular, hard-won triumph. The truth, however, was far darker, more complex, and more devastating to Western security. From the very moment the plans for Operation Gold were drawn up, the KGB knew every single detail. The culprit was George Blake, a mild-mannered, highly placed MI6 officer who was working in Berlin and who was in reality a deeply committed KGB double agent. Blake was part of the ongoing, crippling infiltration that plagued Western intelligence. Blake informed his KGB handlers about the tunnel from the earliest planning stages. The Soviets, brilliant practitioners of counterintelligence, recognized the opportunity immediately. They made a strategic calculation. They would allow the tunnel to run for nearly a year. The KGB fed the Western intelligence agencies carefully crafted disinformation, low-level secrets, outdated data, and political noise, all designed to waste American and British resources, distort their strategic thinking, and protect their real, high-value operations. The KGB was in effect controlling the Western intelligence feed, the colossal effort, the risk, and the millions of dollars invested in the greatest espionage coup of the era had all been secretly neutralized by a single KGB mole. The KGB finally decided to expose the tunnel when its disinformation campaign risked becoming too obvious. On April 21, 1956, the Soviets made their move. East German technicians, supposedly stumbling upon the tunnel during routine cable maintenance, discovered the massive Western tap. The Soviet press immediately seized the incident. They called a massive press conference, parading Western equipment and exposing the tunnel to the global media. The Soviets effectively turned a profound strategic failure into a colossal propaganda victory. The narrative was simple. The so-called peaceful, democratic Western powers were engaging in gangster methods and brazenly violating international law and Soviet sovereignty. The CIA and MI6 were left humiliated, forced to publicly admit the scale of the operation and swallow the bitter pill that they had been comprehensively duped by their own double agents. The real price of Operation Gold was not the cost of the tunnel, but the strategic lesson it ingrained in both the CIA and MI6, the overwhelming, existential danger of paranoia and infiltration. The legacy of Berlin's underground war was the understanding that in the shadow state, the enemy was not always visible, and often, the greatest threat came from within the highest ranks. For the U.S. security state, the greatest fear in the immediate post-war era was not an invasion of Europe, but the ideological infiltration of the Western Hemisphere. The belief that communism must be contained was the bedrock of American foreign policy. In 1959, that containment policy suffered its greatest setback yet, not in a far-off nation, Asia or Africa, but just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Fidel Castro's successful revolution in Cuba toppled the U.S.-friendly, authoritarian regime of Fulgencio Batista. Initially, the U.S. government was wary but open to the new government. However, as Castro moved swiftly to nationalize American-owned sugar plantations, seize U.S. business assets, and critically, establish a clear and rapidly deepening relationship with the Soviet Union, the threat became undeniable. To President Dwight D. Eisenhower and his successor, John F. Kennedy, the existence of a Soviet-aligned communist state in the Caribbean was an existential threat, a knife pointed directly at the heart of American stability. The order was simple and absolute. Regime change must happen, and it must be covert. The job was handed directly to the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The operation to overthrow Castro, known initially as Operation Pluto, was ambitious, massive, and ultimately HUBRISTIC. The plan centered on the recruitment, training, and deployment of a small army of Cuban exiles, mostly anti-Castro fighters who had fled the island. The CIA established training camps in Guatemala, where these exiles were organized into a paramilitary unit known as Brigade 2506. The CIA provided the exiles with everything: training, weapons, landing craft, and even a small clandestine air force using B-26 bombers flown by both Cuban and American pilots. The scope of the operation demanded a large budget and intricate logistics, quickly becoming an open secret in the halls of Washington. The entire mission rested on a single vital assumption: that once the brigade landed, it would serve as a catalyst for a massive internal uprising by the Cuban people, who the CIA believed were only waiting for a signal to overthrow Castro. The CIA had a history of successfully engineering regime change in smaller, less unified nations, as we will explore in the next chapter. And this history bred a dangerous confidence. When John F. Kennedy inherited the Cuban problem in 1961, the plan was already well underway. Kennedy, eager to project strength early in his presidency, approved the invasion. However, he insisted on a critical fatal caveat: the operation must be deniable. Kennedy and his political advisors feared the global fallout if the U.S. were proven to be directly sponsoring an invasion of a sovereign nation. The landing site was moved from a populous area to the more remote Bay of Pigs, Playa Girón, to reduce media visibility. More significantly, Kennedy and his team cut the planned military support to preserve the illusion of deniability. The CIA's original plan called for a series of pre-invasion airstrikes to wipe out Castro's nascent air force, and for continued air support during the landings. Kennedy authorized only a single token airstrike on April 15, 1961, which was easily traced to the U.S. when the remaining strikes were needed on the morning of the main landing. Kennedy, fearful of escalating the conflict and exposing U.S. involvement, canceled the air support entirely. This decision, the result of a fundamental failure to synchronize political risk management with military necessity, doomed the operation. Before the first landing craft touched the beach, the CIA was furious. The military was confused, and the Cuban exiles were sent to their deaths or capture without their necessary cover. The invasion of the Bay of Pigs was a swift, catastrophic failure. Loss of surprise. The token airstrike had already alerted Castro, who had moved his best planes to safety and mobilized his forces. Coral reefs. The CIA had failed to properly scout the landing zone. The coral reefs at the Bay of Pigs destroyed several landing craft and held up the remaining ships, exposing the invaders to Cuban fire. Air superiority. Castro's surviving planes quickly gained air superiority and began sinking the support ships, carrying the brigade's main supplies, ammunition, and communications equipment. The brigade was cut off and cut to pieces. No uprising. The core assumption of the operation, a massive internal uprising, never materialized. Castro's security forces were effective, and popular support for the exiled invaders was non-existent. Within 72 hours, Brigade 2506 was annihilated. Over 1,200 exiles were captured, and more than 100 were killed. The invaders were quickly paraded through Havana, a powerful, chilling spectacle of American failure and humiliation. The Bay of Pigs was a strategic and political disaster of the highest order. For the young Kennedy administration, it was a profound embarrassment. The U.S. denial of involvement was immediately exposed as a bald-faced lie on the world stage. The USSR seized the propaganda victory, painting the U.S. as an imperialist aggressor attempting to bully a small sovereign nation. For the CIA, the repercussions were immediate and severe. The agency was accused of incompetence, misjudgment, and gross operational failure. Kennedy demanded answers, and in the immediate aftermath, severely limited the agency's operational role. Allen Dulles, the storied director of Central Intelligence, who had presided over the agency's golden age, was forced to resign, along with several of his deputies. the official post-mortem highlighted several intelligence failures. A failure to understand Cuban support for Castro, a failure to effectively communicate with the White House, and an institutionalized belief that U.S. power could simply solve any geopolitical problem through covert force. The legacy of the Bay of Pigs, however, went deeper than mere humiliation. It taught every part of the U.S. security state a bitter, transformative lesson. For the White House, it taught President Kennedy the danger of relying on career intelligence professionals whose operational priorities might override political risk. Kennedy's distrust of the CIA would deepen, leading to a much more cautious approach to future interventions. For the CIA, the agency felt deeply betrayed by Kennedy's last-minute cancellation of air support. They viewed their failure not as an intelligence error, but as a political castration by the White House. This created a deep, institutionalized resentment and a renewed commitment to securing operational autonomy in future actions. The lesson learned was not don't do covert action, but do it without political oversight. For the Soviets, it emboldened Nikita Khrushchev, convincing him that the new American president was young, weak, and politically vulnerable. This confidence led directly to Khrushchev's greatest gamble, deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba just 18 months later, setting the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. The Bay of Pigs was not just a historical failure. It was the essential, tragic prequel to the greatest nuclear standoff of the Cold War. The humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, 1961, was still years away, but the need to demonstrate the effectiveness of the CIA's covert action mandate was immediate and intense. The 1950s saw the agency execute two nearly back-to-back operations that would define the practice of regime change, establishing a pattern that was cheap, quick, and most importantly, initially successful. These operations were not about fighting communism directly, but about securing economic and strategic interests in the name of containment. The blueprint involved three key elements: propaganda, paramilitary pressure, and political bribery. The CIA was looking for soft targets, smaller nations with valuable resources and volatile domestic politics, where a small nudge could topple a government. The first such target was the epicenter of the global oil supply, Iran. For decades, the oil wealth of Iran had been controlled by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC. The arrangement was vastly profitable for Britain, but left Iran with a mere fraction of the revenue and no control over its own national resource. In 1951, the charismatic, democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh rose to power on a wave of popular nationalism. His defining action was the nationalization of the AIOC, placing control of Iran's oil into Iranian hands. This move was seen by Britain as an existential economic threat and by the US as a dangerous precursor to Soviet alignment. Mossadegh was not a communist, but to Western intelligence, his defiance of Western capital was interpreted as providing an opening for Soviet influence. The British attempted to overthrow Mossadegh and, failing that, appealed to the United States for help. The operation to overthrow Mossadegh, jointly run by the CIA and the British MI6, was codenamed TPAJAX, or simply Ajax in the US. It was spearheaded by CIA agent Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, who arrived in Tehran with a small team and a large suitcase of cash. The plan was a textbook example of psychological warfare, propaganda, and disinformation. The CIA bought off key Iranian journalists and newspaper editors, flooding the press with articles painting Mossadegh as a dangerous fanatic, a pawn of the Soviets, and a threat to Islam. The objective was to turn the Iranian street against its leader. Military and political bribery. Roosevelt distributed vast sums of money to senior Iranian military officers, members of parliament, and influential religious figures, securing their loyalty to the pro-Western Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. hired street thugs. The CIA hired and organized mobs of impoverished, pro-Shah demonstrators, often criminal elements, to stage massive, violent, and highly disruptive protests in the streets of Tehran, creating the appearance of a spontaneous national uprising. The initial attempt to carry out the coup in August 1953 failed badly, leading to the arrest of several CIA assets and forcing Kermit Roosevelt Jr. into temporary hiding. Mossadegh seemed to have won, but Roosevelt, with immense grit and the CIA's virtually unlimited slush fund, launched a second relentless push. For 2 more days, the fabricated mobs and the prepaid military units executed their plan. The chaos grew so intense that the military, which Mossadegh thought was loyal, defected en masse. On August 19, 1953, Mossadegh was overthrown and arrested. He would spend the rest of his life under house arrest. The Shah was returned from exile and installed as the absolute monarch of Iran. The IOC was restructured into a consortium that granted the US and its allies control over Iranian oil for decades. For the US intelligence community, Ajax was hailed as an unqualified triumph. It was cheap, bloodless on the US side, and secured a vital strategic asset. However, the price for Iran was a bitter, enduring memory. The US intervention ended Iran's fragile democratic experiment and installed the authoritarian Shah, whose brutal secret police, Savak, were trained and funded by the CIA and Israeli intelligence. This intervention created a deep, permanent sense of national grievance, the feeling that the US had crushed the Iranian people's right to self-determination simply to secure oil profits. This anti-American sentiment became the founding ideology of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which ultimately toppled the Shah and transformed Iran into the geopolitical rival it remains today. The shadow state had succeeded in 1953, but the historical backlash it engineered in 1979 continues to shape global politics. If Iran was about oil, the second key coup was about bananas. In 1954, the US turned its covert attention to Central America, a region the US historically treated as its own economic backyard. The focus was Guatemala, a country heavily dominated by the powerful U.S.-based United Fruit Company, UFC, an agricultural giant that effectively functioned as a state within a state. Guatemala's democratically elected president, Jacobo Renz Guzman, enacted a sweeping, moderate land reform policy designed to address centuries of deep inequality. The reform targeted large, idle land holdings, offering compensation to owners and distributing the land to poor, landless farmers. Crucially, this land reform seized massive tracts of unused acreage owned by the United Fruit Company, the UFC, which enjoyed deep ties to the Eisenhower administration and had former CIA Director Alan Dulles on its legal team, immediately launched a massive lobbying campaign, labeling Arbenz's moderate land reform as creeping communism. The Eisenhower administration, still reeling from McCarthyism and convinced by the relentless lobbying, greenlit the CIA's plan for regime change, Operation PB Success. The operation was led by CIA operative Frank Wisner and was a masterpiece of psychological warfare over actual military force. The total invasion force consisted of only about 480 men, a laughably small number to invade a sovereign nation. The true weapon was not the paramilitary force, but the radio waves. The CIA established the clandestine Voice of Liberation radio station, broadcast from a neighboring country. This station became the central pillar of the operation. Using sophisticated propaganda techniques, the station played relentless, highly dramatized broadcasts that claimed to be transmitted from within Guatemala, reporting massive, fictitious battles, defections of military units, and the unstoppable advance of an army of liberation. The broadcasts instilled nationwide panic and created the perception of an overwhelming, imminent invasion. Meanwhile, the CIA's tiny paramilitary force, led by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, made small, harassing attacks on government military installations. These were designed not to win battles, but to provide plausible cover for the Voice of Liberation's dramatic reports. The propaganda worked perfectly. The Guatemalan military, already heavily penetrated by CIA agents and demoralized by the belief that they were facing a vast UC-backed army, began to defect. The CIA had successfully manufactured a state of collapse without firing a single decisive shot. On June 27, 1954, fearing a massive, non-existent invasion, and betrayed by his own military, President Renz resigned. The CIA quickly installed Castillo Armas as the new dictator. The immediate victory was celebrated in Washington. The threat of communism had been eliminated, and the United Fruit Company's lands were returned. PBSS served as the ideal model for future covert operations. High propaganda, low cost, and minimal U.S. military exposure. But the long-term price was catastrophic. The coup reversed Arbenz's land reform, plunging the vast majority of the population back into poverty and injustice. It ended a decade of nascent democracy in Guatemala and inaugurated a long succession of brutal, U.S.-backed military dictatorships. The resulting political oppression and massive economic inequality fueled a decades-long civil war that saw widespread, systematic human rights abuses and genocidal campaigns against the indigenous Mayan population. Hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans were killed or displaced in the subsequent decades of violence. The CIA's successful intervention in 1954 did not bring stability. It tore the social fabric of the nation apart, creating a humanitarian disaster. And the very conditions, instability, and political extremism that the Cold War was meant to prevent. The coups in Iran and Guatemala were the CIA's operational high water mark in the 1950s. They proved that a small, dedicated intelligence agency could achieve results that were impossible for the diplomatic corps or the conventional military. But they also revealed the dark, enduring legacy of the shadow state, prioritizing economy over democracy. Both coups targeted democratically elected leaders who threatened U.S. commercial interests, demonstrating that economic stability and anti-communist paranoia often superseded the U.S. commitment to democratic self-determination, generating generational resentment. By ending these democratic experiments, the U.S. became synonymous with authoritarian control in both the Middle East and Central America. This sowed the seeds of hatred and mistrust that continue to haunt U.S. foreign policy, creating an environment ripe for extremism and terrorist recruitment. These were not just historical events. They were the original sin of the modern American security apparatus, defining its capabilities, its moral ambiguity, and the profound, long-lasting consequences of its actions. By the late 1950s, the Cold War was increasingly defined by the terrifying specter of the missile gap. The United States, having failed to penetrate Soviet missile development and deployment sites through conventional human espionage, was consumed by paranoia. Was the Soviet Union truly ahead in nuclear missile technology? Were American cities vulnerable to a surprise nuclear strike? To answer this existential question, President Dwight D. Eisenhower turned to the one place the Soviet Union could not reach: the stratosphere. The CIA was tasked with developing and operating an aircraft capable of flying reconnaissance missions deep into Soviet airspace, high above the reach of Soviet fighter jets and radar. The result was a technological marvel. The U-2 Dragon Lady. The U-2 spy plane was unlike anything else in the sky. Built by Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works under designer Kelly Johnson, the U-2 was essentially a powerful jet engine bolted to a glider. It was designed to fly consistently at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet 2 miles higher than any aircraft the Soviet Union possessed. From this astonishing height, The U-2's cameras, equipped with lenses that spanned the width of the fuselage, could photograph objects as small as a newspaper headline on the ground. The plane was a perfect instrument of the shadow state, invisible, silent, and capable of gathering decisive intelligence on Soviet military installations, bomber bases, and missile sites. The flights began in 1956. Each mission was a calculated, enormous risk. A single plane carried the weight of U.S. strategic knowledge, and the pilot civilian contractors hired by the CIA understood that if they were captured, the U.S. government would officially deny all knowledge of their existence. The U-2 flights immediately confirmed that the missile gap was a fiction. The U.S. was, in fact, far ahead of the Soviets in both bomber and missile technology. But the flights continued, pushed by the constant need for more intelligence and the belief that the plane was simply untouchable. The Soviet Union was aware of the U-2 flights from the beginning. Soviet radar often tracked the high-altitude intruder, but their interceptor jets could not climb high enough to engage, and their early surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, were primitive and unreliable. For 4 years, the Soviets endured the humiliation of foreign aircraft crossing their sovereign airspace with impunity. This humiliation intensified the Soviet drive to develop a countermeasure. On May 1, 1960, a major Soviet holiday, the U.S. launched a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers from Peshawar, Pakistan, on a mission to fly deep over Soviet territory, including the high-priority missile development site at Sverdlovsk. Before landing in Norway, the Soviets were waiting. Over Sverdlovsk, the Soviet Defense Forces launched a volley of the new, highly effective SA-2 guideline SAMs. The first missiles missed, but the shockwaves from the nearby explosions were enough to tear the U-2 apart. Powers was not killed, but his plane spiraled into a catastrophic breakup. Powers managed to bail out, escaping the wreckage to land by parachute deep inside Soviet territory. The official silence from the Soviet Union following the shootdown was immediate and unnerving. In Washington, President Eisenhower and the CIA were informed that the U-2 was missing. Assuming Powers followed standard protocol to activate a self-destruct mechanism and use a poison suicide needle, the U.S. concluded that the pilot was dead and the evidence was destroyed. Based on this assumption, the U.S. government executed the established cover story, officially and publicly. NASA, the civilian space agency, issued a press release claiming that a weather research aircraft had gone missing after its pilot reported oxygen difficulties. That this was not a low-level denial. It was a lie authorized at the highest levels of government, a fundamental deception of the global community and the American public. The U.S. was caught in the trap of its own arrogance and complacency. 4 days later, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet in Moscow. He began his speech by casually announcing that an American spy plane had been shot down over Soviet territory. The international community was already concerned, but Khrushchev, smiling, deliberately allowed the U.S. to continue propagating the NAS a cover story. Then on May 7, 1960, Khrushchev delivered the devastating second act. The Soviet Union had captured the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, and recovered significant portions of the plane's wreckage, including the mission cameras and undeveloped film. The impact was catastrophic. Eisenhower, who had personally authorized the U-2 missions, was caught in a blatant, public, and embarrassing lie. Khrushchev had intentionally humiliated the U.S. president on the world stage, destroying American diplomatic credibility in a matter of hours. The timing of the incident could not have been worse. Just 2 weeks later, Eisenhower was scheduled to attend a major four-power summit in Paris with Khrushchev, aimed at reducing Cold War tensions and negotiating disarmament. Khrushchev arrived in Paris demanding a full public apology from Eisenhower for the violation of Soviet airspace and sovereignty. Eisenhower, facing the unassailable evidence and the captured pilot, was forced to admit that the U-2 flights were in fact espionage missions authorized by the U.S. government. However, he refused to apologize, citing the necessity of defending the U.S. against the closed, secretive nature of the USSR. Khrushchev, seizing the opportunity to portray the U.S. as an aggressive, untrustworthy imperial power, exploded. He condemned the U.S., withdrew his invitation for Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union, and torpedoed the entire Paris summit. The summit collapsed entirely, destroying the last best chance for arms limitation and sending U.S.-Soviet relations to their lowest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Francis Gary Powers was tried in the Soviet Union for espionage and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. His dramatic capture and the ensuing diplomatic crisis taught the shadow state a vital, lasting lesson. Technological superiority could not overcome the necessity of a believable exit strategy and plausible deniability, especially when dealing with an adversary determined to expose deception. The story of Francis Gary Powers and the U-2 did not end there. 2 years later, in 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Powers became the focus of the most famous spy exchange in history. On the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, Powers was traded for the top Soviet KGB intelligence officer, Colonel Rudolf Abel, a spy whose story had been immortalized in the American consciousness. The U-2 incident, therefore, serves as a powerful symbol of the entire Cold War intelligence complex. The reliance on breathtaking technology, the use of high-level government deception, and the willingness to trade human assets in a ruthless, complex, and deadly global chess game. The legacy was permanent distrust, a breakdown of diplomacy, and the understanding that in the shadow state, the truth was the first casualty, while the CIA fought the existential war against the KGB on foreign soil, and in the high skies, another, far older intelligence apparatus was engaged in a parallel conflict on American soil. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The director of this powerful agency was J. Edgar Hoover, a figure who defined the security state for nearly 5 decades. Hoover built the FBI into a modern, formidable law enforcement body, but his true, lasting legacy lies in his creation of a vast, secret domestic surveillance apparatus aimed not at foreign spies, but at American political dissent. Hoover viewed his mission not just as law enforcement, but as the protector of the American way of life against all perceived threats, a definition that soon blurred the lines between genuine espionage and legitimate political opposition. Hoover became the longest-serving director of any major U.S. government agency, commanding the FBI from 1924 until his death in 1972. His longevity and his relentless commitment to information gathering provided him with immense unchecked power. Hoover's key tool was his secret file system. The FBI collected damaging and compromising information not just on foreign agents, but on American politicians, civil rights leaders, celebrities, and even presidents. This immense cache of personal and political secrets served as a form of blackmail, granting Hoover influence and protection that few men in Washington dared challenge. By the 1950s and 60s, the Cold War ideology provided Hoover with the ultimate justification for total surveillance, national security, and anti-communism. Any group or individual advocating for radical social change, civil rights, anti-war, or economic reform was viewed through the lens of potential communist subversion, becoming fair game for the shadow state. In 1956, Hoover formalized his program of political espionage, creating the COINTELPRO counterintelligence program. The purpose of COINTELPRO was not merely to gather intelligence, but to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize organizations deemed politically subversive. COINTELPRO was a secret, unauthorized program that deliberately circumvented legal and constitutional protections. It utilized every tool of the security state to destabilize domestic political groups. Infiltration, the pervasive use of informants to provoke internal conflicts, gather intelligence, and sow distrust within target organizations. Psychological warfare, the use of disinformation, propaganda, media leaks, and forged documents to ruin the reputations of leaders and dissolve their organizations. Electronic surveillance, unauthorized wiretaps and hidden microphones placed in homes, offices, and hotel rooms. Hoover's most infamous and destructive target was the civil rights movement and its most visible leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Hoover viewed King not as a champion of American ideals, but as a dangerous radical with potential communist affiliations. Paranoia rooted in flimsy evidence, but fueled by Hoover's own political conservatism and segregationist views. The FBI launched an intense campaign of electronic surveillance against King, wiretapping his homes and the offices of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. The FBI's campaign went far beyond simple monitoring. It became a concerted, vicious attempt to destroy King's public reputation and personal life. The most shocking act of COINTELPRO was the distribution of an anonymous package containing audio recordings of King's private life and a letter urging King to commit suicide before his alleged immoralities were publicly exposed. This was an act of psychological terror authorized and executed by the federal government against one of its most prominent citizens. The civil rights movement was treated by the nation's highest law enforcement agency as an enemy combatant. While King was the most prominent target, COINTELPRO cast a wide net across the rising tide of political dissent that characterized the 1960s. The Black Panther Party, BPP. Hoover declared the BPP to be the single greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. The FBI initiated a campaign of intense pressure, utilizing informants to provoke internal power struggles and engineering violent conflicts with local police departments. This campaign resulted in multiple deaths of BPP members and the effective dismantling of the organization through state-sponsored chaos. The student movement, New Left, anti-war groups, student activist organizations, and leaders who protested the Vietnam War were subjected to constant surveillance. The FBI utilized disinformation to sow distrust between leaders and discredit the anti-war cause in the public eye. Puerto Rican independence groups and environmentalists, any political organization deemed too far left, too nationalist, or too disruptive of the social order became a target for infiltration and neutralization. The tactics were subtle but devastating. Informants would forge letters claiming one leader had embezzled money, or one faction was collaborating with the police, deliberately creating the factionalism and paranoia necessary to ensure the groups self-destructed. The entire COINTELPRO operation and the decades of Hoover's surveillance prior to it operated outside the realm of democratic accountability and constitutional law. Warrants were rarely, if ever, obtained for the widespread wiretapping. The goal was not law enforcement, but political control. The FBI and, by extension, the security state, had effectively carved out a sphere of operation where the laws they were sworn to uphold did not apply. This secret history revealed a profound moral dilemma. How does a democratic nation fight internal subversion without becoming an oppressive police state itself? The actions of the FBI during this period violated the First Amendment, free speech, free assembly, and the Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable search and seizure, on a massive, institutional scale. The power of the state to destroy its citizens' lives based on political disagreement became a chilling reality. The secrecy surrounding COINTELPRO was finally broken on March 8, 1971, when a group of anonymous activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole thousands of secret documents. The documents were released to the press, exposing the massive scope of the FBI's counterintelligence operations against domestic political groups. The public outcry was immediate. Facing intense political pressure and congressional inquiry, the FBI officially terminated COINTELPRO in 1971. However, the methods and the mentality did not vanish. J. Edgar Hoover died in 1972, but the bureaucratic infrastructure and the technological capability for massive domestic surveillance remained firmly in place, waiting for a new crisis, a new enemy, to justify its reawakening. The dark lesson of COINTELPRO is that the intelligence apparatus, once created to fight an external enemy, is perpetually ready to turn its powerful gaze inward, always searching for the next enemy within. The National Security Act of 1947, the law that created the Central Intelligence Agency, contained one clear, non-negotiable directive. The CIA was forbidden from exercising police, subpoena, law enforcement powers, or internal security functions within the United States. Its mission was strictly foreign intelligence. This firewall was designed to prevent the U.S. from ever having a secret police force operating against its own citizens, a lesson learned from totalitarian regimes. While the FBI, as we saw, ruthlessly ignored its own legal boundaries, the CIA was by charter legally confined to operations abroad. But by the late 1960s, the escalating conflict in Vietnam had generated a massive, powerful anti-war movement that spilled out of college campuses and onto the streets of Europe and Asia. For the political leadership in Washington, this organized domestic dissent was viewed not as constitutional free speech, but as a dangerous strategic vulnerability. The White House, first under Lyndon B. Johnson and later under Richard Nixon, became convinced that the massive, embarrassing anti-war movement must be orchestrated and funded by foreign powers. Moscow, Beijing, or Hanoi. The pressure to involve the CIA in proving this link became immense. In 1967, President Lyndon B. Johnson, deeply frustrated by the anti-war demonstrations, orally instructed the CIA to investigate the possibility of foreign communist control over the movement. He essentially ordered the agency to violate its own charter. The CIA, eager to prove its relevance to the White House and perhaps overconfident following its earlier covert action successes, complied. The resulting operation was codenamed Operation CHAOS, a name that, by the standards of internal secrecy, was chillingly apt. Operation Chaos was a massive, illegal undertaking focused on one key objective: to prove that the dissent was not homegrown, but orchestrated by the Soviet Union and its allies. The operation was initially set up within the CIS Counterintelligence Division, essentially turning the skills honed fighting the KGB outward and then inward to target American civilians. Operation Chaos proceeded to systematically ignore every limitation placed on the CIA by the National Security Act. The agency created vast, centralized files on over 13,000 American citizen students, journalists, political activists, and peace organizers. It maintained separate files on more than 72 foreign organizations associated with the anti-war movement. The operation utilized the full arsenal of the shadow state, applying foreign espionage techniques to domestic targets, infiltration, and informants. CIA agents posed as students and activists, infiltrating U.S. universities and political groups both at home and abroad, particularly groups organizing marches in London, Paris, and Rome. Physical surveillance. Agents conducted physical surveillance of U.S. citizens traveling abroad, tracking their movements, contacts, and meetings with foreign nationals. Illegal mail opening. The CIA illegally intercepted and opened tens of thousands of letters and telegrams belonging to Americans suspected of maintaining ties to foreign communist parties. Domestic data sharing. The CIA illegally shared intelligence gathered on U.S. citizens with the FBI's COINTELPRO program, blurring the distinction between the two agencies and reinforcing the domestic security state. The CIA's logic was simple but flawed. If a U.S. citizen met with a representative of a foreign organization while in Paris, the CIA claimed the right to monitor the American citizen from that point onward, arguing the U.S. citizen was now potentially influenced by a foreign power. This broad, self-serving interpretation of their mandate provided the legal fig leaf for a massive surveillance program. The operation ran for 5 years under 2 presidential administrations, consuming vast resources and violating countless constitutional rights. But the central question that justified the entire operation was never answered in the affirmative. The CIA failed to find any evidence that the anti-war movement was controlled, funded, or directed by the Soviet Union, China, or any other foreign communist regime. The movement was, as its leaders claimed, a genuinely indigenous expression of political dissent driven by moral outrage over the Vietnam War. The CIA was forced to conclude that the movement was a constitutional expression of American political freedom, not a foreign subversive plot. However, the findings of chaos were often ignored by the White House, which preferred the politically expedient narrative that the movement was being controlled by external enemies. The operation continued not to find the truth, but to validate the White House's political paranoia. The secrets of the shadow state began to unravel in the early 1970s following the disgrace of the Nixon administration and the revelations of COINTELPRO. The key moment of exposure for the CIA came in 1974, when Seymour Hersh of the New York Times published a front-page article exposing years of illegal CIA domestic activities. The public and political reaction was one of shock and outrage. The nation's foreign spy agency had been waging an unauthorized intelligence war against its own people. In 1975, the U.S. Senate convened the Church Committee, chaired by Senator Frank Church, to investigate the full extent of the intelligence community's abuses, including those carried out under Operation Chaos. The Church Committee investigations revealed the complete picture of systemic illegalities: mail opening, domestic surveillance, assassination plots, and the outright violation of the CIA's founding charter. The investigations concluded that the CIA had been involved in domestic intelligence collection on a far wider basis than it has previously admitted. The results of the Church Committee were transformative. They forced Congress to pass significant intelligence oversight reforms, strengthening the mandate against domestic spying and forcing the CIA to operate under increased scrutiny. The agencies were forced to acknowledge that their operational zeal had trampled the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens. Operation Chaos remains a searing historical example of the danger posed by an unchecked security state. It proved that in moments of high political stress and perceived vulnerability, the lines between protecting democracy abroad and undermining it at home can instantly dissolve. The lesson learned was that the separation between foreign intelligence, CIA, and domestic security, FBI, was a necessity, not merely a formality. But the infrastructure, the methods, and the deep institutional knowledge gained from spying on American citizens never truly went away. That infrastructure, once mobilized, merely waited for the next existential threat, the next crisis to justify its powerful, pervasive return. By the mid-1980s, the Cold War was entering its final decisive decade. The United States, led by the assertive foreign policy of Ronald Reagan, felt a sense of growing confidence. The Soviet system was showing signs of internal decay, and the perception in Washington was that the intelligence advantage had shifted decisively to the West. The sense of superiority bred a dangerous complacency within the American intelligence community, particularly within the CIA's counterintelligence division. The focus shifted heavily toward technical espionage, satellites, computers, and sophisticated electronic surveillance, and away from the messy, tedious, and essential work of watching their own human assets. This complacency created the perfect breeding ground for betrayal. The man who would exploit this institutional weakness and become the most damaging double agent in U.S. history was not a political idealist or a disgruntled operative. He was simply a man consumed by greed, debt, and chronic alcoholism. Aldrich Ames. Aldrich Ames was a career CIA officer who spent over 2 decades working in the agency's Soviet division and its counterintelligence center. He was responsible for handling high-value Soviet agents, double agents working for the U.S., and managing the security of operational methods. He possessed access to the most vital secrets the CIA held, the identities of its most precious Moscow. Sources dot by the mid-1980s, Ames was a mess. His career was stalling due to heavy drinking. He was facing financial strain from a costly divorce, and he had married a second wife, Maria del Rosario Casas de Pai, who was accustomed to a far more extravagant lifestyle than his CIA salary could afford. The motivation for Ames's treason was utterly common: debt. His debts mounted, his desperation grew, and he saw only one solution that matched the catastrophic scale of his problems: selling the secrets of the United States to the KGB. In April 1985, Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. He was a CIA counterintelligence officer, walking in the front door to offer his services for cash. The Soviet KGB handlers, who initially suspected a complex American trap, quickly realized the unparalleled opportunity presented to them. Ames did not offer low-level tactical data. He offered the very names of the Soviet officials who were secretly working as spies for the CIA and the FBI, the highest value human assets the U.S. had cultivated over decades. The transaction was simple and direct. Ames, desperate for $50,000 to solve his immediate financial crisis, was willing to trade the lives and work of his colleagues. The KGB accepted immediately, and their investment paid immediate, devastating dividends. Within weeks of Ames's first exchange, the CIA's Moscow network began to unravel, one by one. Top-tier Soviet officials, men who had risked their lives providing crucial military and political secrets to the West, began to vanish. They were silently arrested, interrogated, and executed by the KGB. Image showing KGB agents making an arrest in Moscow during the 1980s, conveying secrecy and swiftness. The toll was staggering. Over 10 high-value human assets were compromised and executed directly because of Ames's betrayal, along with numerous others imprisoned. These were not low-level informers. They were men like Major General Dmitry Polyakov, who had provided intelligence for 25 years, and Adolf Tolkachev, a scientist who supplied invaluable secrets on Soviet weaponry. The CIA was utterly bewildered. Its most trusted sources were being eliminated, but the agency could find no explanation. Paranoia reigned supreme. The CIA launched a massive internal mole hunt, often targeting innocent officers and crippling morale, all while the actual traitor sat comfortably in the counterintelligence office, orchestrating the damage. The cost of Ames's betrayal to U.S. intelligence cannot be overstated. By the time he was arrested, the KGB had paid him over $4.6 million in cash, making him the richest Soviet spy in history. More importantly, he neutralized virtually every major American intelligence operation against the Soviet Union during the crucial late Cold War period. He provided the KGB with details of used double agent methods, strategic plans, technical capabilities, and personnel. The term billion-dollar traitor was frequently applied to him, reflecting the immense financial and strategic damage he inflicted on the United States. While the agency searched frantically for a systems failure or a technological breach, Ames was hiding the evidence in plain sight, using his massive KGB payments to fund his extravagant lifestyle. He bought a $500,000 house in cash. He drove a new Jaguar. He paid his wife's bills in large, unexplained cash sums. the CIA's bureaucracy, however, was so slow, so complacent, and so convinced of the integrity of its counterintelligence division that the obvious signs of wealth were ignored for almost a decade. Investigators were convinced the mole must be someone at a higher level, focusing on complex psychological motivations rather than simple human greed. The search finally narrowed to Ames in the early 1990s, when a meticulous analysis of his finances finally, prompted by the sheer number of lost assets, revealed the impossible. Ames's cash expenditures vastly exceeded his CIA salary. The FBI took over the investigation, conducting intense surveillance, bugging Ames's car and home, and installing a hidden camera to track his movements. The case was finalized when a search of his home revealed numerous classified documents, and a review of his financial records confirmed the massive, unexplainable KGB deposits. In February 1994, Aldrich Ames and his wife were arrested. The subsequent exposure of the Ames betrayal revealed deep systemic flaws within the CIA, a failure to rotate personnel, inadequate financial scrutiny, and a profound institutional arrogance that believed its internal security was unbreakable. The shame was immense, forcing the agency to completely overhaul its security and counterintelligence procedures. The ultimate lesson of Aldrich Ames was that despite the sophisticated technology, the complex operational theaters, and the geopolitical brinkmanship, the human factor remains the single greatest vulnerability of the shadow state. Greed, addiction, and debt are weapons more effective than any missile, capable of destroying an entire intelligence network from the inside out. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was hailed as the end of the Cold War and the supposed end of the constant threat that had justified the growth of the shadow state. There was brief talk of a peace dividend, and expectations that the massive intelligence apparatus, the CIA, the NSA, the FBI would finally scale back their operations. That scaling back never truly materialized. Instead, the focus quietly shifted from tracking nuclear ICBMs and Kremlin intent to monitoring a dispersed, non-state enemy, transnational terrorism. The structure, the budgets, and the technological capability established during the Cold War were simply redirected. The security state had proved its necessity and was not willing to surrender its institutional power. The agencies, born in the ideological struggle against communism, were now searching for a new, unifying purpose. The search ended brutally on September 11, 2001. The attacks of 9/11 exposed two critical failures of the existing security state. Failure of imagination. The inability to conceive that non-state actors could weaponize civilian aircraft and coordinate such a devastating attack on the U.S. homeland. Failure to connect. The chronic problem of intelligence stovepiping. The refusal of agencies, CIA, FBI, NSA, to share crucial pieces of information, allowing key plots to proceed undiscovered. The reaction to 9/11 was immediate, total, and transformative. The U.S. government moved with breathtaking speed to expand the legal authority and operational scope of its intelligence agencies in ways that would have been unthinkable just a year prior. The legal foundation for this expansion was the U.S. Patriot Act, signed into law in October 2001. The Patriot Act drastically lowered the legal barriers between foreign and domestic intelligence collection. It authorized the security state to surveil activities that had previously been protected by decades of law and precedent, passed in the wake of the Church Committee investigations. The act allowed wider wiretaps, easier access to wiretaps on phones and electronic communication, roving surveillance, allowing surveillance orders to apply to any phone a target might use, rather than a specific device. Expansion of FBI authority greatly increased the ability of the FBI to conduct searches without warrants, based only on the authorization of a special court, the FISA court, the fundamental firewall that prohibited the CIA from operating domestically, and prevented intelligence agencies from engaging in bulk collection on U.S. citizens began to crumble. The shadow state was officially authorized to target American citizens on American soil, merging the powers once wielded separately by the CIA and the FBI. The greatest expansion of power occurred within the National Security Agency, NSA, the agency responsible for signals intelligence. The NSA's original mandate was strictly foreign, eavesdropping on Soviet military communications. After 9/11, that mandate quietly shifted to include mass, dragnet surveillance of global and eventually domestic communications traffic, using secret legal interpretations of the Patriot Act. The NSA implemented massive technological programs designed to collect metadata data about data. This meant collecting phone records, call times, location data, email headers, and financial transactions involving millions of ordinary Americans, under the argument that a terrorist's signature might be hidden within the immense volume. The argument was simple. To find the needle, you must collect the entire haystack. The constitutional problem was equally simple. Collecting the entire haystack meant the government was perpetually infringing on the privacy of every citizen, effectively treating the entire U.S. population as a potential suspect. The true mind-boggling scale of this digital surveillance state was kept secret for over a decade. The government and the intelligence agencies repeatedly denied that they were engaging in mass surveillance of U.S. citizens. That wall of secrecy was broken in June 2013 by Edward Snowden, a former NSA contractor. Snowden leaked thousands of classified NSA documents to journalists, revealing the existence and scope of several highly intrusive surveillance programs. PRISM, a program used to compel major technology companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, etc., to hand over customer data, including emails, video chats, and stored files, to the NSA. Bulk metadata collection, the program that collected the phone records, metadata of virtually every Verizon customer in the United States. The Snowden leaks proved definitively that the security state had evolved into a pervasive digital surveillance machine, capable of tracking the communications, movements, and private lives of its citizens on an unprecedented scale. The fear of Hoover's COINTELPRO had become reality, magnified exponentially by digital technology. The events of 9/11 and the subsequent revelations from the Patriot Act and Snowden leaks confirmed the enduring lesson of the shadow state. The intelligence apparatus, once created, never truly retires. It adapts to new threats and, in doing so, perpetually pushes against the limits of liberty. The Cold War taught the security state to be ruthless and covert. The war on terror taught it to be ubiquitous and digital. Today, the debate continues. Can a nation be truly secure without sacrificing the privacy and constitutional protections of its citizens? The tension between security and liberty, the eternal conflict fueled by fear and justified by necessity, remains the central, unresolved dilemma of the modern American security state. The shadow of the Cold War continues to loom large, not over Europe, but over our own digital lives. The journey of the shadow state, from the hurried signing of the National Security Act in 1947 to the digital dragnet of the post-9/11 era, is the story of a democracy's willingness to embrace secrecy, deception, and overwhelming force in the name of self-preservation. The Cold War apparatus did not vanish with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It merely adapted. The structures built to fight Soviet communism now wage war against transnational terrorism, state-sponsored cyber threats, and foreign influence campaigns. Over 50 years of relentless conflict forged three permanent pillars of the American security state, each with its own profound, lasting cost. The covert action apparatus, forged in the shadows of the coups in Iran and Guatemala and refined through the disaster of the Bay of Pigs. This apparatus established the template for interference in sovereign nations creating long-term instability and anti-American sentiment that persists today. The Internal Threat Protocol, hardened by the embarrassment of Operation Gold and the catastrophic betrayal of Aldrich Ames, the intelligence community learned the terrifying truth: the greatest threat is often the trusted individual within. This required an institutionalized paranoia that is now permanent: the surveillance machine. Built by Edgar Hoover's FBI and perfected by the NSA's digital technology, this pillar shattered the constitutional firewall between foreign and domestic intelligence, creating an infrastructure capable of observing the political, economic, and private life of virtually every person on Earth. The price paid for this security has been measured in human lives and political integrity. It was paid by the executed agents betrayed by moles like Ames, by the people destabilized by coups in Central America, and by the citizens whose constitutional rights were violated by COINTELPRO and Operation Chaos. The story of the U-2 pilot, Francis Gary Powers, epitomizes the Cold War. A man whose life and fate were collateral damage in a high-stakes game of technological and diplomatic deception orchestrated at the highest levels of power. The enduring challenge is that the most necessary powers, the authority to keep secrets, to act covertly, and to conduct surveillance, are also the most corrosive to a democracy based on transparency and accountability. In the 21st century, the shadow state is no longer an optional component of governance. It is a permanent fixture, magnified by technology. The NSA and the CIA now navigate a world where information moves faster than any government can regulate, and where the lines between a foreign threat and a domestic political movement are instantly blurred by the internet. The core dilemma remains the same one faced by every president, general, and director since 1947. How much liberty must be surrendered to ensure survival? The answers are found not in technology, but in political will and judicial oversight. The intelligence apparatus, having adapted from fighting tanks in Berlin to tracking packets on the internet, will continue to grow as long as threats exist. The legacy of the Cold War is not just a collection of historical events. It is a permanent, powerful infrastructure that requires eternal vigilance. The shadow state is always operating, always adapting, and always listening. The central question for every citizen remains: who is watching, and who is watching the watchers? Thank you for listening to The Shadow State, Espionage, Lies, and the Cold War's deepest cuts on history by blood. A UDIOBO. If this deep dive into the hidden corridors of power captivated you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. To ensure you never miss a full-length historical saga, let us know in the comments below. Which Cold War intelligence operation, the Iran coup, the Bay of Pigs, or the NSA's digital surveillance, do you believe had the most dangerous long-term impact on U.S. foreign policy?